Hello and welcome back, and that's right, it's time for another Before You Buy, and today we're going to talk about this, the Samsung 990 Pro SSD. And although we've done a big review already, we did benchmarks on this drive, gone into a lot of detail about NAND placement and the controller that's inside. In this video, it's going to be a lot more to the point. We're going to go through 5 reasons why you might want to consider this SSD as your next gaming, editing, or just general fast storage drive, but we're also going to give you 5 reasons why you might want to sit on the fence just a little bit longer or look at the competition. But before we get straight to the meat and potatoes of this video, quick disclaimer straight off the bat. Now, you may have noticed in the title, I haven't quite decided yet, but this is the 4TB model of this drive, released in autumn 2023. However, there is a 1TB and a 2TB model for this series that's been available since the tail end of 2022. And although the majority of points in this video can be applied to pretty much all of the 990 Pro series, I will say there are a couple of points, I'll try and highlight them, that are very specific to the 4TB model recently released. Kind of the high point of that whole product family there, released right at the tail end, but for good and bad reasons, we're going to be highlighting some very specific items to this drive. But for now, let's crack on into the meat of this video with number 1. That is right. When it comes to Gen 4 performance of M2 NVMe's, this is kind of, I'm always reluctant to say it because these videos can get dated. This is the peak performance drive in the market right now in Gen 4. What does that mean? Well, when it comes to the 4th generation of M2 NVMe, that gen isn't just some sort of, oh, it's a new car off the forecourt. The gen actually applies to PCIe architecture. And as PCIe architecture, that's kind of what everything is built on in PCs, stemming from the CPU and the motherboard there. That effectively allows a certain degree of transmission of data at certain speeds and packet types all the way through the system, and Gen 4 applies per lane up to 2000 megabytes per second transmission of data, and this is a Gen 4 times 4 drive. 2000 times 4 equals 8000. Now that 8000 isn't the performance of the drive. In the same way, a road doesn't immediately say how many cars are there. It allows up to that performance, and Gen 4 times 4 has an allowance of up to 8000 megabytes per second, and no drive fully saturates or fills that pipeline there. However, this drive has got the furthest any drive has, at least at the time of recording, to saturate in that full connection, with a reported 7450 megabytes per second sequential read. That's big, blocky, easy data in a line, large data in read performance, and in write performance 6900. There is yet to be a drive that has a reported sustained transfer write speed of 7000 or higher. This is 6900 for write, putting it the highest out there, and in terms of read, 7400. That extends also to IOPS or individual or to input outputs per second, or IO numbers. And at 4K random, that is the smallest 4 kilobit there, randomly accessed from the drive at any time, a reported 1.4 over 1.55 million at the lower capacities, and at the higher capacity of 4TB there, you're looking at crossing into 1.5, 1.6 million random 4K IOPS across this drive. Again, putting it higher than any other drive in the Gen 4 series. Yes, it's one of the last drives, arguably, because although Gen 4 isn't down and out, it is certainly at the tail end of its kind of market life. But I will say right now, if you're looking for the fastest, highest performing drive in Gen 4, well, you're looking at it. You know that comment I just made about the tail end of Gen 4? Well, Gen 4 of M2 NVMe's kind of hit the ground running in about 2019. And in 2019, we saw the early generations of it, and then later on we saw kind of the advanced, the 7K drives, they were pretty much known as, that could cross into the 7000 megabytes per second sequential read area. Now, Right now we are entering the beginning of the next gen, known as Gen 5, and there are a lot of users that may be wondering, why on earth would I buy a Gen 4 drive at the end of its lifespan when, a Gen 4 drive at the end of its serviceable life in terms of marketability, when Gen 5 and all the other client devices are now starting to be developed and be more affordable with Gen 5 SSDs. Well, and I hate to make another gaming comparison as I do on this channel, whenever you look at games consoles, your PS1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's always at the tail end of the lifespan of those devices, or the serviceable, marketable production cycle of those devices, where you see the best games. You see the best because they've learned so much about the architecture. Look at The Last of Us Part 1 and 2. I'm saying that they make the very most of the hardware architecture because they've learned the most how to wring every single kilobit. Now, Gen 5 right now, it's still early days. Gen 5, although that first started rolling out to consumers in early 2022, the earliest releases in Gen 5 weren't great. Notwithstanding the hardware architecture of the PCs that were around weren't really able to get any kind of sustained performance, they were looking at about 9 to 10 gigabytes per second, or 9,000 to 10,000 megabytes per second. Remember, this gives you 7,450 megabytes per second, and it's substantially lower in cost. There's also, right now, as far as Gen 5 is concerned, issues not only around sustained performance at Gen 5, but also cooling, something we'll touch on later on. And Gen 5 SSDs are getting extraordinarily hot, and having active cooling systems, either with enormous heatsinks on board, rather than going for something noisy, or going for active fan assisted heatsinks, which are going to generate a little bit of noise and obviously have the very tiniest increase in power consumption. All of that adds up to, right now, as much as some of you might be thinking getting a Gen 4 SSD at the tail end of kind of commercial development in Gen 4 is coming to an end, it's got to be said that Gen 5 is nowhere near established or as efficient, or I would argue as value, as Gen 4 right now for most users looking to jump onto a high-speed drive. This next point is one that really applies to a very small number of SSD manufacturers, and the key word there is manufacturer, key SSD manufacturers in the market right now. Predominantly consumer we're looking at here, but when we look at this drive, you know that Samsung label on the top? That's not the only thing here that's Samsung. Everything from the controller to the NAND to the DRAM, that memory flash on there, is in-house, either utilised by Samsung's own development teams there, or partnered or conglomerate companies from within Samsung. It's a pure first-party SSD. Now, is that important? Well, in modern SSDs, probably not the most fancy, but it's certainly one that we could give kudos to, because what that means is every component on this board has been geared and effectively designed and engineered to be working with those other components only. Now, they're not the only brand in consumer circles, and we'll talk more about these guys later, but WD are another brand that only use in-house production. But what that comes down to is when you look at the majority of other Gen 4 SSDs in the market, a lot of them are using third-party brands such as Micron to get the NAND, where the actual storage is, the flash. They go to Phison or Innogrit or Silicon Motion. It was on the right there on the edge of my brain. That's right. They use a lot of third-party brands to produce the components, which then they apply to a PCB. Now, again, that means that a lot of those components have to be a little bit more open-ended and up to the firmware and the SSD brand themselves to, tinker and tweak and make to their own setup there. But when you're looking at an SSD that has got everything in-house, that means it's all engineered in-house in a very precise fashion to this. This takes advantage of the SSD, the Pascal SSD controller inside here. It also arrives with a 176 layer NAND on board there, and it's all single-sided, but more on that in a moment. But ultimately, this SSD being all developed in-house does mean that it can often be a lot more affordable. That's why you see it during sales as well, because the brand has, a larger amount of control over its production, availability and pricing than other brands with third parties that, because they've had to buy a certain number of components from third-party brands to create these ranges, they don't have that level of flexibility to hand. And going to that point I just touched on there, this is a single-sided SSD. Now, that's not rare. A lot of SSDs are single-sided. But the thing that makes this intriguing is it's a single-sided 4 terabyte SSD. There is no chips on the back, and the entire component mix is there on the top. Now, there are pros and cons to that. Obviously, we'll touch on the cons later on. But that means if you're running a much more compact system, then you are going to be concerned with, one, heat generating from this being controllable, but two, you may only have very slim cavities to use this drive, or use very small, compact heat sinks for this device. So the result is having an SSD that has NAND components all on one side reduces the space you're going to need to install this, not only for the SSD, but for heat dissipation all the way around it. They've got a copper heat shield on the base of that. You can't quite make it out there on the bottom, but we do go into a bit more detail in the full review. But ultimately, for more compact, thin, light systems, and we're seeing a lot more of those laptops that are arriving right now that are ultra thin, that are arriving with Gen 4, 11th and 12th Gen CPUs from the likes of Intel. They're really going to benefit from a much more compact, slim SSD, where the heat dissipation and just generally the space afforded to it doesn't need to be that big. And finally, a point I alluded to earlier on, but we have to go into a little bit more detail, availability and pricing. Not only because this drive being single party results in a better range and scaling that the brand and indeed the number of resellers afterwards can afford to its pricing, again, why you see it on sale all the time, but more important and effective to that, it means that even when you look at its predecessor, something we'll touch on later on, the 980 Pro that came out at the tail end of 2020, the pricing of this drive is really, really, really similar to this. The 4TB, of course, there is no 4TB of the 980 Pro, so there isn't anything to compare against. But when you look at the 1TB and the 2TB, you definitely see that the scaling cost up to this, despite all the extra development, the improved controller, the improved NAND layer depth on this drive, despite all of that and the enhanced performance over it in both read and write, the pricing is only a fraction more. So in terms of its availability, again, 4TB is rolling out very, very slowly, but the 1 and 2TB is more frequently available. Both the pricing and the availability of the 990 Pro is definitely something to write home about. But it's not all good. We can't just, sing praises on this. We've got to stay balanced. And alongside those 5 great things, there are 5 things about this drive that really may rub you up the wrong way. So let's get on with our first downer.
Come on, that's just the way it is.
If you've already watched the full review, you know what I'm going to say. This drive runs really hot. Now, we're used to Gen 4 SSDs being hot. I've, among many people, have really urged and told you to get yourself heat sinks. Even if you're running a PS5, get yourself that L10 heatsink or scale it up. Go for the Sabrent. Either use Sabrent's chunky heatsink or use Sabrent's own PS5 heatsink. I've talked about those. That's my favourite PS5 heatsink. But given that this is the tail end of the Gen 4 generation of SSDs in terms of development, and that this SSD benefits from a lot of that development, this drive ran extraordinarily hot. And during my review, I tried to utilise it without the heatsink, and you can buy this with a heatsink, more on that in a moment. But when I ran it without the heatsink and run just a casual test, it leapt so quickly into the 50 and 60 degrees, it was incredible. And I was worried it would ruin the tests. I even went ahead and tried several different heatsinks prior to filming the heatsink portion of that review, and ended up having to go for the massive copper pipe laden Sabrent heatsink. Again, this is like 20-30 nicker. It's not the cheapest heatsink, but it's the one that I use when SSDs are getting super, super hot. Now, you can buy this with a heatsink, and it costs barely a tenner more. So you can get Samsung's own pre-applied heatsink with this for just a fraction of cost more. It's at the factory level when it's attached. It's a good heatsink indeed. But still, nonetheless, even with that heatsink, this SSD ran hot. So do bear in mind, if you're going to be doing sustained utilization of this drive, it's going to get warm, and if you've got your crystal disk, it's going to make that alert there quite often.
Come on, that's just the way it is.
you remember earlier when I mentioned about this drive matching that of its predecessor quite well in terms of pricing? Well, that's good and bad, because it's definitely not the cheapest SSD in the market. Now, what do I mean by that? When they've rolled it out, they've tried to keep things within at least the remit of Gen 4 SSDs, but this drive is closer to its RRP than most drives I see. On this channel, we've reviewed a lot of Gen 4 SSDs over the last couple of years, and if you compare it, the obvious comparisons for the Samsung will always be the WD Black SN850 and 850X, and it will be the Seagate Firecuda 530, two great SSDs. And both of those are cheaper than this. Now, they've been in the market longer, they've been around longer, therefore the availability for them and pricing gets to be a little bit more dynamic over time. I get it. But given this drive is arriving at the tail end of the Gen 4 generation of SSDs in terms of production and development, I'm kind of surprised that Samsung took that long to not only release the 1 and 2 TB at the tail end of 2022 with performance on those that was comparable but a pinch higher than most other SSDs in the market for 15% less in cost. But the 4 TB has come out this late. Seems incredible to me. And given it's arrived that late and at such a price tag that it has, for those of you looking for 4 TB of fast storage, there have been options for 4 TB Gen 4 SSDs with plus 7,000 megabytes per second performance for a very, very, very long time, more than 2 years. So it's blown my mind that Samsung have taken this long to roll this out. But on top of that, that this SSD is priced the way it is.
Come on, that's just the way it is.
And returning to the subject of Gen 5 SSDs versus this Gen 4 SSD, I stand by what I said. Gen 5 is not quite there yet in terms of development and what you can get from it, and particularly the client machines that are wrapped around it. But still, nevertheless, if you're buying an SSD today, you plan on using that SSD for quite a few years. You might even be chopping and changing that SSD into new systems down the line. And when you're buying a drive today, there is going to be something of a, I'm not so sure, about buying a drive like the 990 Pro at the tail end of Gen 4 development when Gen 5 is going the way it is. And Gen 5 SSDs are starting to come down in price. We've reviewed several of them on the channel, and say for example this is the most recent one we reviewed, the ADATA Legend 970. This SSD has come down in price, and although it costs more than this drive, it's not out of this world more expensive once you factor in extra years and the fact that this is a 10 gig over 10 gig per second SSD. Then we looked at the likes of the Next Storage as well, and the Next Storage SSD here, not only have they got their own 10 gig over 10 gig SSD, which by the way is seeing discounts in a lot of locations, but already, and we've got a video on this coming soon, it might already be live, they've already rolled out development units of their next follow-up, which is a much, much faster version, which is going to be cracking somewhere between that 12 gig and the 14 gig development on those. Now, yes, you're going to be paying more for those, but in terms of future-proofing, Gen 5 is starting to come down in price, and you might see the benefits as hardware client systems are improving more and more. So if you're buying just the SSD now, but you think you're going to scale up the rest of your hardware architecture later, going Gen 5 might make more sense in the long run. And then you've got brands like Seagate, then you've got lots of other Gigabyte, Team Group, all of these brands all rolling out Gen 5 SSDs right now, starting to crack the 10 gig, the 12 gig, getting closer to the 14 gig, and more SSD controllers being developed for Gen 5 means that Gen 5, although it's not there yet, is very much on the way. And in terms of future-proofing right now, buying a Gen 4 SSD right now, if you wait just a handful of months, might mean you miss out on spending just a few more bob and getting a great Gen 5 SSD and all of the future-proofing that it includes.
Come on, that's just the way it is.
And following up my earlier point about the 990 Pro being the follow-up to the, almost 2.5 years older 980 Pro there, I've got to say, the fact that the 980 Pro exists kind of undermines the 990 Pro in some ways. These are not a follow-up. These are two drives designed to exist in the same space, and I don't see Samsung phasing out this drive anytime soon. And when you look online, this drive is on sale a lot. It is around a lot. It's got a heatsink version that's coming down in price. It is incredibly common as a drive that not only was one of the first to crack the 7K Gen, 7,000 megs per second Gen 4 SSD generation, but on top of that has persisted and been around for a long time. And it's had a lot of firmware updates. Yes, I'm going to touch on that one in a moment. But the 980 Pro there, I've got to say, the fact that it exists for a lot of you when its price point, it sees insane sales sometimes, and given its performance is still pretty darn good, cracking 7,000 megs over 5,500 megs, and with 1 million IOPS on both read and write, and exactly the same durability as the 990 Pro, and it doesn't get as hot as that SSD sometimes, may mean that the fact that the 980 Pro exists may very well undermine buying the 990 Pro for you anyway. But just bear in mind that the 4TB 990 Pro, they're the only Samsung SSD commercially at 4TB in the Gen 4 space. But this drive arrives in 120 gig, 250 gig, 500 gig, there are a huge range of capacities, which is just another reason why if you're only looking for a smaller OS drive, there's no point spending extra on a faster drive you might not be able to take advantage of, or space that you're never even going to need.
Come on, that's just the way it is.
Let's be honest, if I hadn't touched on this one, you guys would have absolutely lynched me in the comments, but it is important to note, because if you're just buying this SSD now, you may not be aware, but earlier in 2023 and in the late stages of 2022, Samsung suffered something of a PR firmware-based... What do I mean by that? Well, ultimately, their firmware started showing some users' SSDs to have degrading health in the smart values. What does that mean in English? What it means is the SSD was showing a degrading health value, which if it gets down to 0, your drive cannot be used. Ultimately tells the system, nah, we're not using it. Now, we never really got confirmation if the degrading health was actually happening, or if this was kind of a misleading false positive, or positive false, whatever you want to call it, of the firmware showing the SSD health depreciating, but it wasn't actually depreciating. We never really found out for certain if that was the case, but ultimately it led to a lot of people with SSDs that were declining in health, not after years, after weeks or months. And it turned out to be a firmware update that was causing this. Now, since then, Samsung have rolled out a patch which, again, future SSDs and the 4TB will definitely not have this factor. This isn't a thing anymore, and you apply that firmware update and that depreciating health value isn't a thing. However, all indications online seem to indicate, one, that those of you that had an SSD that had depreciating health, it didn't just go boop, back to 100, hence that question mark about the legitimacy, yes or no, whether that health depreciating factor was real or not, but also that the SSDs that have got that old firmware update are still out there. Now, when you buy an SSD, as it rolls off the production line, the latest stable firmware is applied to that SSD. But the 980 Pro and the 990 Pro were both impacted by this, and the 980 has been around for a long time, and this firmware issue pertained to both the 990 and the 980. That firmware was across both of them. So a lot of users, when they buy an SSD, if you're putting it in a PC system, you can update the firmware pretty easy. You just download the Samsung Magician software that's included. Firmware update is really quick, and it's done within the OS. You can't really, or indeed easily, update the firmware on an M2 NVMe over a USB dock. There are a few PCI and Thunderbolt external docks that allow you to do it, but they're very expensive. But users that were buying drives like these to go in a PS5, there are no ways to update the firmware of an SSD within the PS5 closed system. So there are so many users that went out, bought an SSD, slammed it in their PS5, started gaming. And there's no way for them to know that that health value is going down, because you can only see it in SMART tests and Samsung's Magician. Everywhere else, you can't see it. So it might be inside your PS5 now, and you don't know that that depreciating health value is going down unless you slam it inside a PC to find out. Now, again, this firmware update has been rolled out that fixes it, and 990 Pros, particularly the 4TB, do not have that errant firmware knocking around on there. But still, nonetheless, we cannot ignore the fact that Samsung not only let this happen, but it took as long as it did for the firmware to turn around, and there are still users out there that are unsatisfied with the conclusion based on the SSDs they have, or the fact that they're still not aware whether their SSD they have in their possession is hit by this. And remember, early 990 Pros that were rolled out had that too, which are going to be out there in the world. So, again, if you, regardless of the outcome of this video for you, whether you go for the 990 Pro or not, check your firmware, and when, if possible, if you can have access to a system that has an M2 slot, update the firmware on an SSD the day you get it, to get the latest firmware, to make sure not only you benefit from performance or durability improvements that firmware update has eked out of Gen 4 and that architecture across the NAND and the controller, but on top of that, to make sure if there's any fixes that stop stuff like those health depreciating values kick in. But this has been 5 reasons you should go for the new Samsung 990 Pro 4TB and the other capacities, and 5 reasons why you might want to sit on the fence or look at a competitor. In the description is a link to our massive Samsung 990 Pro review, as well as a link to the video I mentioned earlier, which goes through all of the benchmarks and all of that stuff, so do check that out. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. If you still need assistance choosing an SSD for your needs, you can of course use our free advice section, link below, the Discord, the free community support forum, Ask NAS Compares, or just go into the comments and let me know there, or email me on an email address which I'm pretty sure you can figure out what it is. Apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.